the student had lost 10 to 1 to another student in the class, and he was not at all convinced that he had much talent. The other professors reacted with some restraint, saying that this was not expected, but he was still special admission number 1, so was he sure that there was nothing special about him. Professor Bahil pretended to think about it and then added that he had good stamina, having endured 9 curses of exhaustion before he collapsed in his first class. The other professors were not at all pleased. 9 times is certainly a lot and stamina is good, but not at all impressive for special admission number 1. While everyone was discussing the students, Professor Aaron, as usual, was bored on the sidelines. Unfortunately for him, Bahil noticed him and told him that he was also teaching a class today, wasn't he? Aaron was in no hurry to answer and calmly poured himself some tea. Then he turned to them and said that yes, he was teaching the class. But this answer did not satisfy Bahil at all, and he asked him directly what he thought about special admission number 1. Aaron realized that he couldn't avoid answering, so he said that in his opinion special admission number 1 is a slow mediocre guy, but he has a little originality to make some creative though defective designs. Bahil's hand with the cup trembled from this answer, although no one noticed. Everyone started whispering and discussing that the number 1 special admission was not so special this year and wondered how that could be, since it was chosen by Nephthys herself. Bahil couldn't believe what had just happened. It seemed that only he had noticed it, so Aaron had put up a smokescreen in front of everyone and not said everything, which could only mean one thing. Aaron was known to be a complicated person and such a statement from him meant only one thing: he liked special admission number 1 very much. Bahil knew it for sure. After all, a slow and mediocre guy with originality in making creative defective designs. It was the best compliment Aaron could give. Bahil continued to think, the guy chosen by Nephthys and set on by the fastidious Aaron was becoming more and more interesting to Bahil, and he had a desire to play with Aaron for a while. He approached him and the latter turned to him with a questioning look. Bahil asked about the statement he had made last year. Did he still stand by it? Aaron did not understand what he was talking about and asked again, last year? Yes, that statement that Aaron was no longer going to directly mentor students. Bahil said it with a seemingly friendly and innocent smile, but Aaron understood what was behind the question and lost all his confidence. He started to stammer out an excuse that he didn't mean it, when suddenly, bam! Nephthys herself joyfully burst into the room, greeting everyone there. Immediately, all conversations stopped and everyone bowed their heads in respect to her, and she continued to greet them carefree as if they were not her subordinates, just friends. Bahil took out an ice cream from his magic pocket and was about to give it to Nephthys with a smile. She kind of exclaimed in surprise that she was surprised and had already told him to stop spoiling her like a child, but nevertheless reached out for the ice cream. Bahil told her that the virtue of being a gentleman included preparing snacks for a lady. Nephthys was pleased, waiting for the opportunity to taste her gift, and said what a smooth talker he was, and she just had to take this ice cream since she was given it. The other professors were shocked that he was carrying around a subspace freezer. Another professor pulled out a chair for her and invited her to sit down. She gladly sat down and asked how the students had performed on the first day. And the professors began to praise the different students they had talked about before, and Nephthys began to eat her ice cream with pleasure and agreed with everything. She was very pleased with so many talented students in this year's first year and hoped that the protection period for new students would soon be over. Aaron looked at Nephthys and hesitated. Nephthys smugly said that it was all great and they could report any problems to her, and if there were none, then because it was the first day of school, they could go home early and rest. Everyone was all for it. But Aaron was not going to leave and asked Nephthys if they could discuss something in private. All the professors were very surprised and looked at him questioningly, but Nephthys was not at all confused by this question and she gladly agreed. Bahil watched them leave the room. As they left, Nephthys asked what Aaron wanted to discuss, but he said he would tell her only when they were alone. Bahil noted to himself that Aaron was as straightforward as ever. But he didn't worry about it, because Nephthys would never just say what they wanted to know. Let's get back to our students. Simon and Dick were looking for a place in the dormitory, and in all the rooms they had visited there was only one free place left, and they wanted to share a room. Simon knew what the reason was. They had come to the dorm too late. All the students who were looking for a room were from their group, because summonology lasted 3 hours, so students from other groups had already taken almost all the rooms. They approached the girl in charge of student accommodation and asked if there were any rooms with 2 more free places. But she told them that unfortunately there were no such rooms on the first and second floors. Also, after looking at the scheme, they found out together that even on the third and fourth floors there were no 2 free places, as well as on all other floors. They asked if they could go to the rooms and try to negotiate with the students to change places. And when they were told yes, Simon told Dick that he wanted to go look around the floors and try to find something, in case something worked out. The girl said she would go with them and help them, and she didn't notice that a group of students was approaching them from the side. Suddenly, they told the girl to move away and then immediately hit her with a tray with their suitcases. The girl fell down and the suitcases fell apart. One of those students claimed that it was all her fault, he had told her to move. The poor girl started apologizing. They told her that a caretaker like her only gets in the way, and all this happened because of her. How would she compensate them for the damage? The girl only managed to apologize under a stream of accusations and insults. When she apologized, they told her to excuse her ass for standing there, to quickly pack up her things and get out of their way. The poor girl agreed and said she would do it. But they were interrupted by Simon, who told them he was sorry, but can't they see he was talking to her? And he stood between the girl and these hooligans. Dick backed him up, saying that they were here first, so they shouldn't cut in line, and that they saw them deliberately hit the girl. It seems that these guys were nobles, so they asked them arrogantly if they were out of their minds. They were commoners, what do they think they are? However, one of them noticed something and started to push his friends. He pointed at Simon and said that he had seen him before and that he was special admission number 1 and that he had taken the oath in front of all the students. Simon's appearance scared them. They quickly and nervously packed their bags and quickly got away, threatening the girl to be careful next time. Dick laughed at those losers, and the girl thanked Simon for his help and he assured her that she didn't need to thank him, he just did what he had to do. The girl was very grateful to them and invited them to follow her. She checked her notes again more carefully and happily reported that there was actually 1 room left with 2 free beds. It was on the 4th floor, room 409, it had a great view and was close to the main staircase. She started checking which students had already moved in while our friends waited behind her. But something was wrong. The girl turned to them and uncertainly said that rooms 412 and 413 also had vacancies and were located next to each other and invited them to look at them. The friends did not understand what was wrong with room 409 and asked her. The girl began to clumsily excuse herself by saying that students were already living there. And one of them. But Simon didn't seem to care and just wanted to join those who were already living there. Then she told him a story about a student who lived there. His name was Kizen, and he had already studied here last year. Simon then had a logical question about what he was doing in the freshman dormitory. The girl explained that he was unable to transfer to the second year. She had heard that he had some problems and had to start over. She whispered to them that she was just a dormitory supervisor and didn't know all the details, but she had heard that many of those who shared a room with him had asked for permission to change rooms. Those students had bruises on their faces and he got into trouble because of it. Usually Kizen quickly expels problem students, so it was strange that they made an exception for Kizen. Dick started to ask Simon to choose another room. But he wanted to at least say hello to the residents of room 409, and Dick was shocked by this idea. He asked if he was really going to go in there. Simon took hold of the doorknob and creaked the door open. They walked into a room that was in semi-darkness. Simon said hello and apologized for the intrusion and for waking the residents. The silhouette lying on the bed stirred. A bandaged hand gripped the edge of the bed as Simon asked if they could move into the room. Dick was terrified at the prospect of living with such a neighbor, but Simon seemed to have no qualms. A man got up from the bed, looking at the uninvited guests with a murderous look. When Simon entered the room, he asked the man with all his politeness if he would mind if they shared a room with him. Although the man's look and appearance was quite scary. But the look of his red eye with a scar made goosebumps run through his body. It turned out that he was not as angry as he seemed at first glance. He sat up on the bed holding his head and remarked that time was flying fast since today was the initiation ceremony for the newcomers. He added that they didn't have to be so nice to him, he wasn't a professor, and after all, he was a freshman like them. Dick was still scared and hid behind Simon, who came closer to the bed and agreed, but made another mistake and called his new roommate Mr. Kizen. He told him to drop it and just call him Kizen. He turned to them and told them that he didn't know how long they would be staying at this school, but they should remember two things. The first thing was to keep their noses out of his business. The second thing was not to make any noise or fuss until he went to bed, and once he was asleep, they could dance, sing, or do whatever they wanted. But Kizen still hadn't answered whether he allowed them to stay here, so Simon asked if they could stay. Kizen replied that it didn't matter, did it? Someone would come here anyway when there were no more rooms, so they should stay. And he immediately dozed off under their astonished gazes. Simon confidently told the dormitory manager that they were taking the room. She couldn't quite believe it, so she asked if they were sure they would be okay. Simon was sure that they would be fine, because it seemed that their neighbor was not as bad as they had heard about him, although he looked a bit rough. The dormitory manager agreed and just warned them that if they had any problems later, they shouldn't hesitate to let her know. She would then immediately notify the head manager of the dormitories to take care of it. Simon was very grateful to this girl for her concern. They said goodnight and closed the door behind them in their new room 409 with a creak. Dick asked if he really thought their neighbor would not wake up. Simon wasn't sure, but he had just told them to do whatever they wanted as long as he was asleep. So Dick decided to check it out. He threw the stack of books he was holding and they hit the floor very loudly, scaring Simon. And it turned out that Kizen was indeed still sleeping despite the noise. Dick was beginning to like him, and he said that in the end he didn't think Kizen was a bad person, as long as they followed his rules they had nothing to worry about. And since they had found their room and moved their stuff, it was time to take a shower. He had seen the bathhouse on the second floor on their way up and he was going to check it out. Simon asked quite cautiously, "A bath?" A minute later he was already shouting in excitement how much he loved her, and it was obvious because he was beaming with happiness. He had never felt so warm and soft. As they walked back together from the bath, Dick was surprised that he had never seen anyone so enthusiastic about an ordinary shower stall. He asked Simon with a smile if he had ever lived far away in the mountains or something similar. Simon replied that yes, something like that. Dick continued to talk and asked him to at least stop saying, "Wow," every time he pressed the buttons in the shower. Other students would not understand this behavior. Simon asked if he really did that. Dick assured him that he was, and now the whole school would not only be talking about him as special submission number 1, but now he would be called a bumpkin on top of being called a fake. Simon was ashamed of this prospect. They went into their room talking about how good it was to be in Kizen and how lucky they were to be here. They probably all wanted to be here. But whether or not they could stay here depended on their grades. Simon had heard that only 300 or so students in their second year were supposed to stay. Dick said that this was true. There are so many cohorts of students now only because there is still a period of student protection and they just have to wait a little bit and they will see at least half of the students drop out right away. But Simon didn't know what the protection period meant, so he asked what it was. Dick explained to him that it is a period when professors cannot officially evaluate students and give them grades. During this period professors cannot personally communicate with students and they cannot expel students at their discretion. They also can't harm students, and there are so many other things that are forbidden, he can't remember them all. Simon was shocked by this information, so he was still being lenient in everything that happened today. What would happen next? Dick continued that after this period, expulsions would be a constant occurrence due to lack of academic performance, lack of visibility of future success, rule violations, unsatisfactory homework, and other lesser reasons. But, if he can hang in there at least until the end of his first year, he can expect to find a job almost anywhere in the future. And if he can survive the intense competition and officially graduate, then he will be a leader in an era that will move entire continents. And Dick pointed his finger directly at the surprised Simon. Then he added that he would be able to become absolutely anything, except a member of the royal family. Although in fact, some small kingdom might offer him a princess to marry if he could graduate from Kizen. Simon heard this and asked if he wanted to become a nobleman. Dick replied that no, although there would be many advantages if he were one, it was not his goal. Simon then clarified his question, what then is his goal? Dick held up his hand and showed him how he rubbed his fingers in a well-known gesture. Money, that was his main and probably only goal. Simon now had an idea of what lay ahead and was serious about working hard to stay in Kizen as long as possible. He started rubbing his ring that Lorraine had bought him. Dick had already started to say that if he ever needed money, he would. When suddenly Simon opened his subspace and a box with a set of dice flew out, surprising and maybe even scaring his friend a little. The latter was amazed and did not hesitate to show it, he just bombarded Simon with questions. What is this? And how did he just do that? Simon explained that it was subspace. And in his hands he was holding a skeleton kit for an island ratman. He had bought it when he was shopping with Lorraine. Now he was going to practice to catch up with the other students who were taking the preparatory courses. Dick couldn't believe that he was going to practice after they had just come from class, and Simon replied that he just didn't want to forget everything he had learned and experienced today in summonology class. Then he asked that this time he was going to put it together in the right order this time, right? But Simon replied that he wanted to try again to trust his gut feeling this time. He began to assemble the bone by bone, following his gut instinct. Dick watched him fascinated. A few minutes later, another unusual skeleton Simon had assembled was walking across the floor. Dick looked at it and noted that it was the same as the one he had collected in the classroom. Simon replied that yes, in general it was the same, but it should have been better, because he spent more time on it, but one of its legs was wobbly for some reason. Despite the fact that it was a skeleton, it was even somewhat cute. Dick said that despite his shortcomings, Simon had made a skeleton that he probably would never be able to. Simon apologized to his incomprehensible creature, who was looking at him questioningly. And the next moment he broke it into its component parts with a crunch. His friend was very surprised by this behavior. He asked what was wrong. It was such a beautiful skeleton, why did he destroy it? Simon did not answer, absorbed in his thoughts, and this made Dick worry about him. He was absorbed in the memories of today's summoning class, recalling the words of Professor Aaron, who said that skeletons formed with summoning magic have a tendency to take their original form, and showed how easily two bones can be joined as if by attraction. The official name for this phenomenon is restoring force. Simon also remembered that this phenomenon was also called the attraction in the field. He closed his eyes, exhaled, and focused on his inner sense. And he began to clearly feel every bone scattered around the room. Nothing else mattered to him now. Because skeletons have a tendency to go back to their original form, so if he remembers the sequence. Assembly shouldn't be hard. With a rattling sound, the bones that had been lying close to each other began to slowly move closer together. Simon looked closely at the skull, which was quietly clicking on the floor, and he had an idea. Instead of manually reassembling each bone by hand, he could simply use summoning magic to make them reassemble themselves to their original shape. So he stood up and pointed his hand at the pile of bones on the floor and said, "Restore." And in a moment, the skull's red eyes lit up and the whole room was filled with the sound of bones breaking. Dick was a little scared as the bones started flying by him with a whistle. A minute later, with the last snaps and clicks, the whole island ratman was on the floor of the room. Dick remarked that it was incredible to see the skeleton put itself together, and Simon was pleased that he could entertain his friend a little. Meanwhile, Ratman was running and jumping around the room. Dick was very sleepy and yawning, but he still wanted to know how Simon could do it even without training. But eventually sleep overcame his curiosity. He told Simon that it was late and he was very sleepy, he should go to bed. Then he asked Simon if he was going to sleep, but he couldn't get enough of his summon. He kept petting his Ratman and said that he wanted to try it out more. Dick didn't mind and he would just go to bed first. But before he went to bed, Simon managed to ask him what time was their first class tomorrow. Dick asked again, "Tomorrow?" And he immediately answered, "Darkness Dynamics." While they were talking, Simon was stroking his skeleton and his eyes changed from red to midnight blue. Dick had long since fallen asleep, and Simon was still sitting on the floor studying the diagram, his skeleton sitting across from him, tapping its bones softly. Simon was wondering how he could connect the bones so that the knees could rotate, although they might be Ratman's bones, but maybe they could move like human bones if he put them in a different order. He held one of the bones in his hands and thought about what to do with it. But after twisting the bone in his hands, he came to the conclusion that it wouldn't. Just putting the Ratman's inverted joint. The other way around wouldn't work. He began to add and correct something in his notes. He wrote the following: the assembly formulas are the standards that necromancers have established over a long time, so there must have been numerous trials and errors to get to this point. Just like he is now. Every task has its reason and meaning, and after repeating the assembly himself, he realized how great the previous generations of necromancers were. After the inspection, he put the skeleton's leg back in place. Then he added another arm, trying to replace number 25 with number 31. He asked his creatures if they were comfortable, to which they swung their heads in different directions. He realized that this combination was not very good and decided to put the bones back in their places. Then he thought that no matter how reasonable the structure is, there is always a more efficient way to assemble a motor mechanism for a skeleton. He wondered how he could learn all this quickly. He picked up the book and decided that he would research this question in more detail. He remembered his father, whose skeletons had helped people with their possessions. And Lorraine, whose skeletons had helped them deal with a gang that had attacked him. He looked at his Ratman, whose eyes burned with blue darkness, and wondered what he was missing compared to his father and Lorraine. Simon just couldn't wait for his next summonology class to learn more. The next morning at the first class, the students were listening to a lecture on darkness dynamics. The professor stood in front of the class and told them how important darkness dynamics was to the students. The professor's name was Eric Ora, and he was the one who was going to teach the class. He was quite monotonous in his talk, which caused most of the students to doze off, but not Simon, who was listening intently. The professor asked a rhetorical question: so then how does this darkness create the miracle that is black magic? And went on to explain that to answer this question they needed to understand the flow of darkness, runic words, and the mechanisms of the magic circle. Professor Eric Ora decided to delve into history and explain to them the origin of runic words, which had its roots in the eternally burning torch of the Temple of Del. Initially, none of the ancient people wondered why this torch never went out, even though no one fed it with fuel. Why? Because people then deemed doubting God to be blasphemous in itself. But one day they noticed that the ashes from the torch resembled letters. And they were very surprised by the fact that behind such a miracle as the eternal torch were ordinary letters. The professor concluded his story by saying that this is the story behind the origin of runic words. Simon was fascinated, while the other students were already falling asleep from boredom. The professor continued, telling them that the wizards and necromancers who discovered and researched the ancient runic words made countless improvements to create the modern runes of today. He began drawing runes and magic circles on the board, commenting that runic words after all the improvements today look like this, and these two magic circles are examples of how the improved runic words are used. This magic circle on the left that they saw could not have been activated. And the difference between it and that circle on the right, which can be activated, is how the runic words are used. Simon listened carefully and took notes. The professor continued, and the students took notes that thanks to the corrective devices they used they had the ability to use the darkness more freely and quickly even without training. Finally, the boring lecture was over and the professor put the piece of chalk back, but before all the students left, he gave them a homework assignment to do before the next class. The assignment was as follows: they had to use one of the magic circles that could not be activated that were demonstrated for them as an example and then provide possible ways to modify it, with the corresponding calculations and formulas they used to make those circles work. The bell rang to announce the end of the lesson. And the teacher said that in the next class he would call 3 students to present their assignments. And he said goodbye to them, saying that he was looking forward to seeing them next time. After the lesson was over, Simon and Dick went outside on their way to the next class, which was to be held outdoors. They complained to each other about how difficult darkness dynamics was. Dick compared it to the arithmetic he learned with his father, wondering why he couldn't just memorize a formula, but had to understand the principles. However, Simon noted that it wasn't so bad. Although he didn't understand more than half of it, he liked the way the professor described everything in order, starting with the principles. Dick countered that he just loves everything about Kizen. Even this morning, when he was admiring the soap in the bathroom. Simon hit his friend on the shoulder for this remark. The island looked incredible in the sunshine as our friends walked farther and farther away from the school buildings. As they walked across the dandelion-filled meadow, Dick asked Simon what class they were going to. Simon replied that they were going to a magic combat class. When they arrived at the clearing where their lesson was to take place, the professor was nowhere to be seen and they were beginning to have doubts about whether they had come to the right place. When Jamie Victoria pointed somewhere to the side, attracting the attention of everyone present. A cloud of dust was approaching them with a thud and they did not understand who or what it could be and why the ground was shaking so much. A flock of creatures was running toward them. It turned out that it was a whole flock of hippos running right at the frightened students. The frightened students gathered in a circle and trembled as the pack of hippos surrounded them and ran around. The students did not understand what was happening and where the hippos came from. But suddenly someone from the middle of the pack greeted them. A guy was sitting on one of the hippos and he told them that Professor Homping would be teaching his class today in the Roque Mountains. So they all had to get on the hippos to get there quickly. The students and our two friends were not at all excited about the prospect of riding these animals. Dick said that he was not surprised at all, because the professor of magic combat is known in Kizen for being a weirdo. He had even heard that she camps in different parts of the Roque Mountains. Simon couldn't quite believe it. Some of the students began to resent the fact that they had to ride it, even though the hippos looked friendly enough. But the noble students demanded that they put a rug or something on the animal's back before they got on. But the man who brought the hippos here was not at all happy with this attitude and began to gather darkness around his feet. And then he jumped incredibly high with a flip in the air under the admiring gazes of the students. And he began to land directly on that disgruntled nobleman who was shocked by this turn of events. And the man landed right on top of him, driving him into the ground. The others began to complain about what he had done. How could he stand in their way? They were Kizen students. How dare he be so brazen? The man asked again, a servant? He angrily told them how uneducated the new students were these days. He told the already frightened students that they should call him Ta, not servant. The students began to nervously apologize, especially the one on the ground. Simon, watching this scene, commented that they don't change, do they? Dick completely agreed with him and added that he was an exception to the nobility. After dealing with the impudent nobles, the man told everyone that they were a little behind schedule, so everyone had to get on the hippos quickly. One hippo could carry 3 students, and our two friends immediately chose one and began to get on it, some more successfully, some less. Dick finally managed to get on the back and sit behind Simon and whined about how big these hippos were and how difficult it was to climb them. Simon noticed a little girl trying to climb on their animal as well. While she was trying to climb, their guide saw that almost everyone could see and was about to give the animals the command to move. Simon asked her if she needed help and offered her his hand to help her up. She grabbed his hand and was very grateful for the help. Simon quickly lifted her up and sat her down in front of him. The guide told them to hold on tight. And he commanded the hippos, "Let's go." They quickly ran off with the students on their backs, kicking up clouds of smoke. During this fast trip, the girl Simon helped tried to thank him, but because of the speed and stomping, she only gave Simon a few slaps with her hair and he heard nothing. The other students were in no better shape, almost falling over and wondering what they had to hold on to. The man advised them to overcome this test with a strong will, because this was also part of the test. And he smilingly reminded them that if they fell, the hippos running after them would trample them and they would die. This seemingly logical message only made the students have more questions. Ta continued to frighten the students by telling them that every year there are 1 or 2 accidents in which students die. Frightened, they began to beg for help. demanding that he stop and let them get down to the ground. But Ta was relentless and told them to just keep going, because Kizen doesn't need students who can't hold on to a hippo. Finally, they arrived at a clearing in the mountains, and after such an intense trip, all the students were lying on the grass and were glad to be alive. One of the professor's assistants walked among them and offered each of them a bottle of water. The students were so exhausted that some of them could not even say thank you properly. What a grueling start to the class. Simon, Dick and their new friend sat together on the grass and drank water from the bottles, and it was really nice for them to relax and drink some water after such a trip. But suddenly the girl noticed that birds were flying overhead, which worried her a little bit. And the birds didn't just come for no reason. Someone came up to them and greeted them, saying, "Welcome to my class, everyone." The friends almost choked on their water from this voice, and the water stood up in their throats. The professor had a bird sitting on her shoulder, which also greeted the students with joy. The professor greeted them and introduced herself. Her name was Hongping Tun Soka Marlat. She smilingly informed them that she would be teaching their magic combat class this semester and punched her chest to confirm. A bit of history: this is what the giant undead monster that burned 4 feudal lords to the ground looked like and was called Kundar Hydra. It was this monster that Hongping fought. Professor Hongping is a legend among necromancers because she once fought a mega undead monster for 5 days and she broke all of its 100 necks by herself to win a dramatic victory. And now she was teaching the new generations of necromancers how to fight magically. Now she asked all the students to stand up and to line up in a column of vurs. But the students did not understand what she wanted from them and what the word vurs meant. One of the assistants came to their aid and explained that the professor meant that they should line up in columns of 4 and move quickly. It was only then that the students realized what was being asked of them. When they lined up, the professor said that it was good and now they would go now, but this time the students had questions about where to go. But she didn't answer them and quickly ran down the slope without waiting for anyone, leaving a bunch of confused students behind. But after a moment of hesitation, they were all running after her, as she told them that they should have a sound mind and a sound body. And that the basis of magic combat begins with physical fitness. The students watched her with admiration and agreed that she was incredible and wondered how she could run like that. Simon thought that they also had 2 arms and 2 legs, but their professor was on a completely different level. She continued that the basis of the subject of magical combat is to enhance one's body with darkness and learn combat strategies that their body can use. But there was something strange in her pronunciation of the words, and so the students who ran after her did not understand everything she said. The professor was saying that necromancers who mainly use magic combat are called the battle necromancers. If they reach a certain level of training, the darkness will flow over their bodies as softly as silk. It will also form something similar in shape to a garment that necromancers call the dark robe. This is the very skill that characterizes combat necromancers, and she also warned them to be careful, because of the large number of trees ahead. Poor Dick, who was not used to moving around so much, whined about how he envied the children who had a talent for magical combat. Simon, who looked a little better than him, asked, "Talented kids?" He looked around and saw students running and jumping through trees as if gravity were a joke. And he agreed with Dick that it seemed that while they were suffering here, those students seemed to be having fun. Dick could barely stand up and sweat was pouring down his face. He asked Simon if he was okay. And he answered that yes, he was fine. This answer surprised his friend, who asked him how he could still be fine. Simon told him with a smile that he also had many mountains in his country and it was fun to run around in the mountains like he used to. Dick told him that he was a monster and he was so jealous of him. They kept running until they came to a huge chasm with water raging at the bottom. Professor Hongping explained to them that now their task would be to jump over the gap in front of them using the darkness. One of the students hesitantly asked if they really had to jump over it. Hongping said they could do it using one little trick. Just as they were collecting the darkness in their palms, they could instead direct it into their souls. And she was going to show them an example. So she asked them to be careful. The darkness enveloped her souls before she jumped. And she jumped vertically high up the hill under the astonished gazes of the students. But that wasn't all, she added that if you direct the darkness to your souls several times, you can do this. She moved like a shadow and did somersaults and several sideways movements, as if gravity did not affect her at all. She asked if they could see everything, but there was only silence. Simon and Dick were mesmerized by her movements and just stood there with their mouths open in amazement. She continued, emphasizing to them that as they jumped, they should direct all the darkness they had gathered to their feet as if they were going to spray it from their feet. It should feel as if they were pushing off that darkness and it was pushing them forward. And they jumped from one edge of the gap to the other seemingly without effort or problem, landing on the other side and stopping. She invited all the students to jump with her, but there was not much enthusiasm among them. But some students were brave enough to run to the abyss first. They jumped confidently, as if they had already practiced and had the ability to do so. In a moment, they were on the other side. Some of them landed successfully on their feet, others only managed to grab the edge of the cliff. However, the professor praised all of them for their good work. For those who did not succeed, she explained that if they released the darkness too late it could be dangerous. As it was now, she advised them to release the darkness earlier next time and lifted those hanging on the edge by the hand. Simon repeated to himself in concentration, "Push back on the darkness, push back on the darkness." Dick advised him not to overthink it. Simon objected that it seemed too complicated for him. But his friend assured him that overthinking only makes things more difficult and ran to the edge of the cliff, ready to jump. Simon advised him to be careful, but he jumped right away. As he jumped, a shadow flew right over him. It was our old friend and Simon's sworn enemy, Hector, and he jumped much higher than Dick. The two landed with mixed success. Hector's friends immediately began to congratulate him for the highest jump of all. Dick sat on the ground and dusted himself off, thinking to himself that he didn't like this Hector at all and was getting on his nerves. Simon was one of the last to dare to jump, his friend supporting him as best he could from the other side, telling him that Simon could do it, because even he had done it. Simon was still concentrating on preparing for the jump, repeating the professor's instructions. Finally, he felt ready and ran forward. He jumped and gathered all his darkness in his souls and pushed off. Even Hector and his henchmen had to notice how high Simon had jumped, and they had been waiting for him to fail. He was still flying over the cliff when Dick shouted at him that it was incredible. Simon finally landed and everyone began to congratulate him on his wonderful jump. Dick was especially happy that he had wiped Hector's nose. Simon was over the moon. He shouted with joy, "I did it." Even Professor Hongping was amazed and stunned by his jump, not to mention the other students. Almost everyone was happy for him and congratulated him. It was a real victory for him and he could not contain his joy. However, his joy was not shared by everyone. Hector gritted his teeth and furiously held back everything inside him. His hatred for this Simon, who had already beaten him for the second time, was growing more and more. The professor happily announced that everyone seemed to have crossed the chasm, but they had to wait for the students who had fallen a little bit down, and as soon as they got up to them, they would all go to a new area to continue the lesson. Simon was beaming with happiness and answered her happily, "Yes, Professor." On the way back, Dick turned to Simon and asked him, holding out the book, if he wanted to check it out. Dick looked at the book and asked with interest what it was. When he opened the book he replied that it was a list of students they had to recruit for the group classes that were to start next week. Dick also added that he thought they should start preparing now. In addition, he had already listed and written down everyone's names, strengths, and characteristics in a notebook. Looking at the notes in his friend's notebook, Simon asked with surprise and admiration how he had been able to research all this. To which he replied that it was a trade secret. Watching his friend's joyful face as he continued to talk excitedly in his notebook, Simon couldn't help but notice that while he struggled to keep up with his lectures, Dick managed to find time to observe others even during class. It was clear to him at that moment why he had come to him and not to Hector, for after observing him he had come to the conclusion that he could not get along with him. Turning to Dick, Simon asked him what his opinion was based on the results of the study. He hid his notebook and replied that most of the students in their class were highly qualified, and all of them were pretty good, but... Pointing to the pink-haired girl who rode the hippo with them, Dick noted that she might be expelled as soon as the protective period expired. Adding that there were only 2 kids in their class who couldn't jump over the abyss, and this girl was one of them. She was also very shy, which could lead to bullying. Suddenly, a loud voice was heard from Professor Hongpeng, who started running and shouted to the students to follow her as they were already delayed. The tired students who were hoping for a break sighed pitifully. Simon, saying that this class was so fun and dynamic, followed her with eager eyes, while Dick, who did not particularly share his enthusiasm, marveled once more at his friend's fervor. The next instant, however, something caught Simon's eye. Suddenly a pack of hippopotamuses appeared in the distance and rushed toward the students, creating dust and vibrations on the ground. When some students saw this, they immediately reported it to Professor Hongpeng, hoping that she would be able to help them. However, to their confusion, it was as if the professor had fallen underground and she was nowhere to be found. Realizing this and seeing a herd of hippos running straight at them, the students panicked. Realizing the pitifulness of the situation, Simon noted that it was very bad and something had to be done. Standing in front of the hippos that were about to reach him, he gathered the darkness in his legs. Then at the last moment he jumped high into the air in front of the hippo. Remembering Dick's words that they would not be in any danger during the students' defense period, he was confused, for he could not understand whether it was all a setup or not. Still in the air, he concluded that if someone could not dodge, he would probably be badly hurt. However, as it turned out, his worries were in vain. The students were able to avoid the bull's attack without any problems. Some cast a curse of exhaustion, others blocked the attack with a shield or simply climbed into trees where they were out of range of the behemoths. Dropping to the ground near Simon suddenly appeared Cindy, who greeted him with a smile on her face. As he landed and realized that it was too early for him to play hero and worry about others, Simon heard someone call out to him. It was Dick, hanging from the pole, who asked him if he was all right, to which Simon nodded affirmatively. There were some worries, however, that he had underestimated his classmates, and now he realized that in the future he would have to compete with thousands of them. Seeing his friend's downcast look, Dick told him not to worry too much about anything, for all these behemoths were under the control of Professor Hongpeng. Adding that she was a master of magical combat, but could also use the druid bloodline. When he was on top, he saw the hippos running around the guys who had fallen to the ground. Simon was a bit surprised by this information as he thought things had gotten out of hand. The instructor arrived and said that the guys had no time to sit around and should get up and start moving. They sighed with fatigue and started to rise to their feet. The instructor kept pushing the students, motivating them by the fact that the hippopotamuses were going back soon, and also adding that the professor was waiting for all of them downstairs. The pink-haired girl staggered to her feet with tears in her eyes and stood up abruptly, saying excitedly that she understood. A light breeze blew between the trees. The students ran out of the forest and into a clearing, the beauty of which took everyone's breath away, and with wide open and amazed eyes, they all stared at the picture before their eyes. In the middle of the clearing dotted with flowers stood their Hongpeng professor, who said that there were no more obstacles and called them to her. With delight, all the students rushed to run to her through the incredibly beautiful green meadow, the beauty of which overwhelmed everyone with excitement. When everyone had arrived, the professor said that now they could rest. Then remembering something added that despite the fact that they were supposed to eat only after a glass, she considering how tired they were had contacted Kizen in advance. The students were puzzled, but everything became immediately clear after the professor pointed her finger at something. It was lunch, which was delivered to the students right there. When the professor asked what her idea was, the students broke out into joyous shouts saying that it was the best. Sitting in the lotus posture and holding the tray of food on his lap, Dick noted that Professor Hongpeng was not like the others. Feeding students in her own class was not what one would expect from all the other strict teachers. However, Simon had a question about this very thing. Even before entering the academy, he had heard a slightly different opinion. Namely that Professor Hongpeng was one of the most typical professors at Kizen. To which Dick contemptuously asked where Simon had heard this nonsense. He answered nothing, thinking to himself that Lorraine would probably not have deceived him. Their conversation was interrupted by the professor, who turned to the students and told them that they had to finish. Some of the students were surprised to be leaving this beautiful place so soon. But Simon had a feeling that this was just the beginning of something. Turning to the students who had gathered in front of her, Professor Hongping asked if they had the bracelets she had given them, to which they amicably replied that they did. She then told the students to let the darkness penetrate them. This action caused the students to immediately feel incredibly heavy and weak, and some of them even fell to their knees not understanding what was going on. The professor, with a smile on her face, pointed to the man with the flag behind her and asked the students if they were all familiar with the curse of exhaustion. She then informed them that their assignment would be to climb the hill with the curse of weakness on it, adding that everyone should be prepared. Then, with a devilish smile on her face, she turned to the students and added that she would be watching them closely. Unable to believe Professor Hongping's new assignment, the weary students didn't want to do another assignment so difficult. Unfortunately, however, they didn't have much of a choice. The next moment, the professor ordered everyone to take their seats. The slumped students, being under the curse of weakening, lined up in a row, barely able to stand on their feet. After the students lined up, Professor Hongping started counting down. The very next moment, she commanded to begin, and the students immediately rushed to run up the mountain towards the flag. After a while, however, the run turned into a very slow walk, each step of which was very difficult. The farther up the hill the students climbed, the closer to the ground they became, some of them even went on all fours. Shaking hands grasped the grass, rocks, and anything else they could grab onto. Simon was no exception, and crawled through the grass like the others. Every step was difficult, and he felt dizzy. But it was nothing compared to the preparatory training, and it was all about endurance and willpower. So he could not give up now, because then he would no longer be able to catch up with the pace of the next classes and would be left behind forever, and that was the decision he made. I will do it no matter what. Simon said to himself in a firm voice as he prepared himself for the challenge he had to overcome. Hector, who was also climbing on all fours and who was only a little taller than Simon, saw him catching up with him and snorted irritably, as he could once again prevent him from taking the first place. He was angry and surprised that even though he had weakened the fatigue spell with his own techniques to get ahead, Simon had managed to keep up with him even without any tricks. But Hector wasn't about to give up. And with more speed he decided that this time he would definitely win. Standing at the top of the mountain, Professor Hongping cheered up the guys telling them that they were almost there. Hector and Simon were ahead of them, crawling on all fours, and they were crawling to the finish line with all their might. And each of them was not going to lose to the other, holding out their hands they said to themselves that this time they would definitely take first place. But their hopes were not to be realized. A foot stepped in front of their outstretched arms. It was none other than Maylene Willen. She walked lightly to the flag as if not feeling the fatigue. Professor Hongping immediately announced that she had won first place, while Simon and Hector stared at the girl with shocked looks, not understanding how this could be. After congratulating the girl on her victory, Professor Hongping asked her what she had done to walk as if there was no curse on her. To which she replied that she had simply unlocked the resistance formula of the fatigue curse. A little surprised and praising the girl, the professor told the one that she could rest. Hearing this, Simon and Hector were even more shocked, as they didn't know that breaking the curse wasn't forbidden by the rules. Suddenly one of the assistants turned to the professor and told him that they had a student with a sprained ankle, to which she immediately replied that she would take a look. She waved goodbye and congratulated them on being almost there and headed off to help, leaving Simon at a loss. With an annoyed sigh, Hector got to his feet and headed up the hill, saying irritably that he must be being bullied. After he climbed the mountain, the professor's assistant immediately informed him that he had won second place. Simon was left sitting on the ground not knowing what to do. Hector approached Maylene, who was sitting under a tree. He asked her in an annoyed voice why she had broken the curse even though they were in a magic class, adding that she wasn't the only one who could do it. However, the girl looked away and said she didn't care what he said. But Hector didn't want to be ignored and said that she really didn't know anything about the world, since she lived like a princess imprisoned in a tower. Maylene looked at him and asked him if he wanted to fight her. He replied that he had no intention of doing so, but was only telling her the truth. Saying that professors don't evaluate them during the defense period. However, during that time it's important to show that you're doing well to get attention. Adding that what she just did will most likely only take away Professor Hongpeng's trust. Not intending to be lectured by him, the girl mockingly asked if he was so hurt by the defeat that he decided to take it out on her. He replied that he was just telling her to stay out of his way. Then turning around and intending to leave, he added that he had no interest in her at all. At the same moment, the instructor handed Simon, who had crawled to the finish line, a bottle of water and told him that he had taken third place. With a sigh of relief he leaned against a tree and sat down on the ground. Maylin and Hector, who were nearby, immediately looked at him. They stood silently waiting for the other participants to arrive. Falling on the grass beside Simon, Dick, tired and worn out, complained to his friend that he felt as if he were going to die. He praised him, saying that he had done a good job, adding that he was tired too. Looking up at the sky, catching flashbacks of the day's events, Dick asked Simon what he thought about how they were going to get home. And would they have to climb the hippopotamuses again, adding that if they did, it would be better to bite their tongues off and not suffer. Suddenly Professor Hongpeng turned to the students again, mispronounced a word. She told them to gather together. There was a magic circle on the ground in front of the students gathered in a pile. Professor Hongpeng explained that since everyone looked very tired, she had contacted the academy again and was allowed to use the teleportation magic circle. Then she told everyone to get in line. The surprised and tired students were incredibly happy about this gift. Simon and Dick waited for their turn to enter the circle. Simon was surprised to see that the teleportation sensations were new to him. However, the landing after teleportation was quite painful, as his landing spot was a wooden table, which he landed on with a shriek and a thud. Rubbing his back and not seeing the familiar surroundings, he wondered where he had gotten to, as he didn't think he had gotten to the academy. However, a voice confirmed his hunch, saying that he had indeed gotten to the wrong place. The voice apologized to him for scaring him. Recognizing the voice, Simon turned around and was surprised to see Professor Hongpeng, who turned to him and told him to sit down, adding that she would explain why he was here. Without waiting for Simon to sit down, the professor informed him that the magic circle had been modified in some unknown way, and after examining it, it became known that someone had added a formula to make it react to the darkness of a particular person. Heading towards the table, Simon asked in a surprised voice, was it really him? The professor handed him a metal mug and said that it was, so when the circle was activated it didn't go to Kizen. Pouring water from the kettle into the cup, she asked him if he had any idea who could have done it. He replied confusedly that he had no idea who it could be. Laughing, Professor Hongpeng told him not to worry, because her job was to protect the students, and that was why he had come to her house. However, she added that she wanted to talk to him personally, which surprised him. Putting her hands together, the professor said that it was against the rules to talk to students during the defense period, but from what she had seen there were already professors who had broken that rule. Simon Valencia. She turned to Simon, who replied excitedly. Don't you want to choose magical combat as your profile? She asked, looking at the boy. She added that if he wanted to she would be willing to take him on as an apprentice. A little puzzled, Simon asked if it meant that he would become her personal student. Professor Hongpeng replied that it was correct, saying that she would be responsible for his training since professors treat their students with full seriousness and responsibility. She added that the performance of direct students was directly related to the professor's reputation, so they could only choose 3 students from each year. She looked at Simon and said that this was the opportunity she wanted to give him. She held out her hand and asked the confused boy if he was ready to be her student. He asked Professor Hongpeng why she had offered it to him, because he had not done well in class today. He could hardly keep up with the other students, and he could only come third on the hill. Besides, today was only the second day of school, so he was sure that her decision to offer him such a thing was not well thought out. The professor, however, folded her hands in front of her with a smile on her face and told him that rankings might be important to students, but professors looked at talent. Then she reminded him of the moment when they jumped over the river using darkness and asked him if it was the first time he had ever used darkness. To which he replied that she was right. To which the professor replied that even though it was the first time he had used darkness, he had jumped higher than all the students in the class, which was no longer a matter of talent or coincidence. In addition, when climbing the hill he only used his stamina and willpower, unlike those two. Then she added, looking at the confused Simon, that even if he thought he hadn't demonstrated anything, he was mistaken, for it was enough for her. When she finished she asked him with a smile if he wanted more compliments. Without waiting for an answer, she continued, saying that his stamina, thinking and incredible talent in using darkness were the best for choosing magic combat. Adding that they were so good that he would surpass even her in a couple years. But even that wasn't the limit, the professor said with confidence in her voice that if she trained him she could make him stronger than anyone. Simon sitting on the chair listened to Professor Humpung's words carefully. He turned to her and thanked her for her generosity in offering to be his student. However, he bowed low and said that he would like to decline. She immediately asked him the reason. Simon replied in a slightly guilty voice that he would like to study another field more deeply at the moment. Upon hearing the answer, Professor Humpung smiled and said that it was fine, adding that she was grateful to him for telling her right away so that she wouldn't have any more questions. However, she added that her agreement did not mean that she would give up on working with him. Hearing this, Simon asked in surprise what she meant. The professor replied that she had already told him about the profile, so she would try her best to change his mind. Simon was surprised at her determination, so he asked her why she was going so far. She replied that it was just personal curiosity, adding that she just wanted to see how strong he could grow. With a wave of her hand that left a blue magical glow behind her, she said that it wasn't just about him becoming her apprentice. Adding that he could come to her for help whenever he wanted. Illuminated by the bright magical glow that made him squint his eyes, Simon thanked the professor. Having finished creating the teleportation circle, Professor Humpung turned to Simon and told him that she didn't want him to tell anyone about the dialogue. She added that the circle had transported him to Kizen, to which he smiled and replied that he was glad. Waving goodbye, she said with a smile that she would see him at the next class. Stepping onto the teleportation circle and turning to the professor, Simon said goodbye with a smile on his face. She looked at the guy as he walked away and thought about something, but she didn't hear the voice calling her. The next moment the door opened and the professor's assistant came into the room and asked her how it went. To which she replied that he had refused. Hearing this, the man immediately became indignant, asking how the guy dared to refuse her, and then he suggested the professor to take Hector as a student, who in his opinion was more talented in magical combat. But he was interrupted by the professor, saying only 2 words, "He's a genius." The assistant standing at the door questioned what she meant. She folded her arms across her chest and said that she had seen many geniuses in Kizen. But she'd never met one like this. He opened the bathroom door. Simon walked in and met Dick, who was toweling his head. He immediately asked him why he'd come in so late. Simon replied that there had been a problem with his teleportation. Realizing that he was all right, Dick said enthusiastically that Simon had no idea what had just happened to him. Not understanding why his friend was so excited, Simon asked what had happened. He replied that when he teleported into the circle, there was a rumbling noise that froze his body. And after he came to himself, he found himself in a completely unfamiliar place. As it turned out, he found himself in the office of Professor Bahil, who was sitting in his chair emitting an eerie aura. Simon remarked that Kizen is a good person despite his appearance. Dick completely agreed with him. Simon asked him what had happened afterwards, wanting to hear the rest of the story. Dick replied that afterward the professor had made him clean his office. In spite of what he was doing, Dick's eyes lit up with joy, because according to the Kizen alumni, professors often guide students in this way. Adding that this was probably what had happened to him and he probably had a chance to be his student. When he realized this, he started jumping up and down and shouting about how cool it was to be a direct student of the professor, because he could enjoy his school life, and if he was a direct student of the professor, he could avoid even being expelled. Simon tried to calm down his restless friend, But he clenched his hand into a fist and said that he couldn't calm down so easily. Hector, who had heard the noise Dick had made, said it was the stupidest nonsense he had ever heard, adding scornfully that a pathetic commoner like him would never be a direct student of Professor Bahil. Hearing the boy's contemptuous words, Dick mockingly asked him if he was so hurt by the words, asking if it was because the professors weren't looking at more than just him. Being angry at the guy's words, Hector said in an irritated voice to watch his words. However, Dick was not going to back down, saying that he had seen the likes of him many times before. Then he added in a mocking voice that he had heard that he had almost fought with Mei Lin in the magic combat class. Then he added that they were equals in this place, so he advised him to stop pretending that he had an advantage because he was trained by the Moore family. He then said that it was probably not Mei Lin who didn't know how the world worked, but him. These words made Hector furious. In the next moment, a large red magic circle appeared in his hand, which was aimed directly at Dick. As a result, many strands of red magic smoke coiled around the guy's body, which, judging by the expression on Dick's face, brought him quite a lot of pain. Simon rushed to his friend, asking what was wrong with him. But Hector did not plan to stop there. He lifted Dick off the ground with his magic and called him a pathetic piece of trash. He slammed him against the wall, angrily asking how he dared to treat him like that. Then he stared at him with a fierce look of murderous intent. He said in a furious voice that he would kill him. Then he intensified his attack and started choking the guy even harder.